Okay, so once again, welcome. Thanks for being here today. We're nice couple of dozen and maybe a bit more at that group of people, all of whom work with community-based global learning, all of whom are in educational and social action spaces. So we're really excited to have you here. One thing that's been special about the collaborative for me personally has been growing from and through members asking incredible questions, challenging us together, and contributing great resources. So we are looking forward to, I know I'm speaking for myself, but also I think the panelists and the spirit they bring, listening to you all and hearing your questions as we go forward today and hearing what you're thinking about. So we have some prepared presentation, and we'll pretty quickly be moving into kind of generative space where we're all able to think together. But I'm really excited to be joined today by Bibi Al-Ebrahim, who's the education director at Amizade. And Bibi's based in Ecuador, where they are currently in a process of occasional power outages. So Bibi expects to be with us for until 1 o'clock Eastern time, and then may drop off. But Melissa Nix is also here from Amizade. Melissa is the Director of Development and Outreach, or at least, yeah, in any case. And sorry, I just need to mess with my controls a little bit. And so we'll have an Amizade voice in the room throughout. Also, we have with us today Richard Kiely, who's Associate Vice Provost for Engagement and Land Grant Affairs at Cornell University, and Mary Price, who's Director of Teaching and Learning at the Forum on Education Abroad. Many of you know these folks and have had the opportunity to learn from them before. I'm really excited because we are, as we love to do at the Collaborative, bridging roles that may have sort of primary locations in Civic or in international or off campus or on campus, but we're hearing from people who really gather together those different components and work through the challenge of figuring out how higher ed interfaces and learning interfaces with addressing real social challenges in a way that's driven by people most affected by those social and environmental challenges. So when we talk about community-based global learning today, the shorthand version of what is the state of community-based global learning, the shorthand version of what that is meaning to us is community-driven learning or development partnerships that include critical reflective practice examining cultural humility and aspirational or critical global citizenship, right? So those things, those four things pull together a lot of our values. And I asked the panelists to please introduce themselves and their work and how it intersects with community-based global learning, and to concretize the conversation a little bit, a favorite program or initiative they have underway now. So I'd like to ask Bibi to start things off for us, and we'll move to Richard and Mary and move the conversation forward from there. And I'll stop the share while we go ahead and hear from Bibi. Thanks, Bibi.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Eric, for the intro. As Eric mentioned, my name is Bibi Al-Ebrahim, and I was the Director of Education with Amizade. It's a confusing time. We're in a transition, but we are actually technically now and officially All People Be Happy. You'll still see Amizade floating around, but same organization, or same ethos, different organizations, same ethos and spirit and values. But we are All People Be Happy, and I am the Director of Global Experiences. And our new mission is, I wanted to read this out just to start us off, is to connect, inspire, and improve the lives of individuals and communities through global learning experiences or community-based learning, and sustainable development projects. So really interesting how these two things are coming together, and I'll speak to that a little later on in my intro here. But as sort of community-based global learning, specifically thinking about community partnerships, thinking about what else, the buckets, right? So thinking about community-driven learning and service, how we develop partnerships, ideas of cultural humility, critical reflection, and aspirational or critical global citizenship. I find myself, I think, in a really unique and something that I find very special in my own professional career. And that is I engage with multiple stakeholders in this work. All People Be Happy, we are in sort of crude terms considered a provider. And in this role as a provider of community development and community global learning, I have the opportunity to engage with community partners around the world, with education partners, as well as with students, and to varying degrees and to differing, or at different stages, excuse me, within sort of the buckets of pre-immersion, immersion, and post-immersion. So I wanted to approach my intro just talking about the way that some of these buckets within community-based learning intersects with my work and these three stakeholders that I sort of converge with regularly. So starting off first with our community partners, we engage as an organization with 18 partners, community partners around the world. We approach this work focusing on building trust through long-term commitments. And we believe that that's really the only path towards building relationships that are mutually beneficial, that are equitable and fair, and that really can lead us to community-driven decision-making. When partnerships are focused on long-term commitment and friendship, right, added as a cornerstone, we're much more likely putting in the necessary time for really honest exploration of what communities are seeking in these types of engagements and these types of partnerships. So, when we put in the time to build relationships and to build friendships, we believe that it's really the only path that will lead us towards understanding what community goals are, understanding the tension points in communities and in the space of community-based learning. And also, we have a better sense of how community goals are evolving over time. So our partners in the field, our community partners around the world, engage in community-based learning and participate in this type of education and engagement for a slew of reasons. And those reasons change and shift over time. But they include things like, as I feel like everybody can imagine here, finances and budgetary questions, right? And how supportive this can be for communities with this type of income stream. It includes the physical service that's done by visitors. They're involved because they find that the cultural exchange for their youth is also incredibly valuable. And that speaks to also their own engagement of like what civic engagement looks like for their own youth. What does it mean to be civically engaged in the communities that are hosting us, right? Or hosting a lot of our students. They're involved in this work also because they're able to tell their own story the way that they want to tell their story, right? And they're able to share and demonstrate and illustrate issues and things happening in their own communities by holding that power to do so. And so controlling that narrative is really valuable for a lot of our community partners. And then also to be a part of young people's journeys to becoming wiser global citizens, right, is something that motivates a lot of our community partners around the world. I'm also outward facing towards education partners. And I'm in a position where I'm able to liaise between our community partners and our education or university partners and trying to help find balance in that the benefit across these relationships. And so it's also working with universities or education partners and understanding what they want to achieve for and with their students. And it's supporting building the education goals from the university side of things with the education goals and community development goals from our community partners. Sometimes in our relationship with education partners, it's a matter of finding like, where's the best fit? Like, what are you hoping to seek, education partner? And of our community partnerships that are long lasting, multi-decade partnerships, where do you best fit, right? So it's not just about, I want to go to Jamaica, but I want to go to Jamaica for all of these, for what the community does and how that might best work with what it is that I'm trying to achieve with my students, right? So in my pursuit of learning goals. And then I think it's really important in my role, and this is sometimes easier than other times, and that is challenging and pushing education partners to rethink their approach to fair trade learning. It's really easy to say that we are culturally humble. It is really easy to say that we are community driven, and we want decisions to be made by our community partners. And we all need to recognize the tension that that's not always clean, right? And we need to recognize the tension that of power dynamics, and those power dynamics clearly exist between our community partners and education partners, primarily universities. And so pushing back, saying no, challenging some of the assumptions when it comes to these relationships is something that I find that I do in my role with All People Be Happy. And then finally, I hope I'm not taking up too much time. Finally, I just wanted to talk about the students from that perspective. When I am on a program and can lead students, it's an amazing journey to accompany, as I'm sure a lot of people in the room know, to accompany students on this journey to apply critical reflection to the experiences that we're having together, and rethinking, like, what does it actually mean in practical terms to be culturally humble? How do I contribute to a fair trade learning? How do I contribute in real ways to fair trade learning? And sort of taking the time to be able to allow students to explore their cultural starting points and identity, understanding how they're responding to the experiences is something that I'm able to do multiple times a year, and it keeps it real fresh. And it's quite inspiring to be able to be with young people as they're starting to rethink their positionality in the world, the power that they hold, not only as global citizens, but also the power that they hold in their own communities, and what that means for when they return home, and how do they start applying what it is that they're learning in their own communities. And I think really importantly, in our programming, it's oftentimes really short, and what we're doing with students flies by. And it's really about trying to teach students critical inquiry, right? What are the powerful questions that we can ask ourselves when we return home? How not only do we apply these learnings for when we return home, but how do we continue to reflect? And those are skills, that we try to start working on the ground, and try to find ways to push them out into their home communities at university or where they were raised, to start trying to apply similar questions about who holds power, the dynamics, the socioeconomic or socio-geopolitical relationships and tensions that we all live in, and how do we challenge them? How do we identify where we sit in those systems? And then we figure out how do we answer the personal question of, how do I want to exist in this world as a citizen of my neighborhood, of my region, of my state, and all of that beyond. And then I'll just share my most recent inspiring program is just a few weeks ago. We were celebrating our 30th Amizade anniversary in Pittsburgh, and we were simultaneously celebrating 3 decades of existence with our second annual Roberto Clemente program, which allowed us for the second year in a row, really exciting, to host youth from Puerto Rico, from our community partner site in Puerto Rico, in our Pittsburgh community site. And that was really special when we think about fair trade learning, and when we think about the learning that we all want young people to have. I find that it's often there's a certain subset of student that has access to this work. And so carving out space and finding the money and making it work so that now hosts are visitors, right? Now hosts aren't the ones teaching, but are the ones being taught in many ways. The hosts being young people having the opportunity to get on the plane for the first time. Really inspiring to bring life to fair trade learning parameters. And like when we think about mutually beneficial programming, just very inspiring. And so that's something that I get really fired up and excited about, is trying to make these types of programs happen more and more often. And it's not a pay to play kind of thing. So I'm going to stop there. I've taken up too much time, but thank you for that.
That was great. Rich time, Bibi. Thank you. And thank you. I will have a very hard time really getting the name change down. It's clear, because I recently was at a celebration of that change. I recently posted on LinkedIn about that name, and there I just said the older name. So thank you, Bibi.
Well, if I didn't wear the t-shirt, I wouldn't have remembered myself.
Oh,
So I had to wear the shirt to remember. So I understand.
Really appreciate it. As we move to Richard Kiely, I wanted to mention that one thing that I really love about All People Be Happy, which is a network I've learned a great deal from, is that it does the work, and the question of accreditation, it forces universities and colleges to figure out on their own, right? Which is probably another way people appreciate, Bibi, how you said it's like crass to think about all these nonprofits as providers, right? This is not quite the right way. What I would say is this is an organization and a network that achieves community-based global learning, and luckily for many higher eds gives them the right to accredit that deep learning, through the ways they work together. But Richard Kiely, on the other hand, works with a large institution where there are many efforts underway related to community-based global learning. Richard, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and how you intersect?
Sure. Hopefully I'll be brief. As Eric mentioned, I'm also the director of our academic programs in the Einhorn Center for Community Engagement, which is a center, a university-wide center that crosses our land grant VP's portfolio and our student affairs portfolio with connections to international and academic affairs and research. Also I'm the associate VP for engagement and land grant affairs at Cornell. And just a little bit about Cornell, just to give a sense of the institutional context, and then I'll just talk a little bit about how it intersects with community-based global learning and our connection to the collaborative, and also just a teeny bit about the evolution of my own positionality in this work that feeds into what I do at Cornell. So Cornell was established in 1865. It's a land grant research university with a public mission. And our motto is any person, any study. And we're established as an ecumenical higher education institution. There's a bunch of, I've come to realize that places like Cornell that are comprehensive doctoral granting research universities, they're driven by colleges in many cases. So, and that's how the students, the faculty, a lot of staff experience Cornell and community partners. So there's 9 undergraduate and 8 graduate and professional colleges. There are a number of different locations where we have colleges. So we have a Cornell Tech in New York City, as well as Weill Medical School. We have institutions overseas. We have research stations outside of Ithaca, New York. And so there are over 80 undergraduate majors and over 100 graduate fields of study, 16,000 undergraduate students, approximately 10,000 graduate professional students, many of whom are international students, students from outside the US, almost 3,000 faculty and over almost 8,000 staff. So it's a big place. A lot of people, if you've been at a big institution, people like to say it's so decentralized. And we like to talk about the big red tape. Big red is sort of who we are. It can be hard to think about institutional change, which is something I'll talk about a little bit later. So my just initial kind of foray into this work was at actually a community college nearby to Cornell. I was teaching political science there. And I helped partner with a community in the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, and a nursing professor. We taught a couple courses and brought some students and some community members and some practitioners down to do work. And that program was sustained for 25 years up until the pandemic. So that was 1993. And it changed my life as an educator that first year. And that might come up a little bit in how I started thinking about myself. But the big point is I was working in a much smaller institution that had a very different kind of mission than Cornell. So the possibilities were very different about what you can and can't do in this space. And then I was fortunate to be able to do my doctorate at Cornell. And while I was doing that, I got to ask a lot of practical questions and then study theory about this particular program in Nicaragua and other things I was learning. So that was a great privilege to actually immerse myself into the scholarship of this field for 4 years, and then have a very practical program where I could say, what is different about the pedagogy? What does it mean to partner with community? These are things I hadn't learned when I was a student or when I was a faculty member. And then I went to the University of Georgia, where I was had a fantastic experience there for 4 years as a junior faculty member, and I was very involved with their institutional efforts to create an Office of Service Learning. learned a lot about that, particularly from an institutional lens, not just as a faculty member, and how to administer and institutionalize this kind of work to better support it. And then I had the privilege of coming back to Cornell, and now I serve in this role from a university-wide center perspective, and then working in an associate VP role. I guess I'll mention two programs, and we'll pull up a slide later on. One program that I'm really excited about, apart from all the work the Einhorn Center does, is I get the opportunity to work with college deans of each of the colleges to become an engaged college. And over time, I've realized the limitations of doing course-based work as an individual faculty member or even with a team of faculty in a particular department. The kind of scale of change at that level is often not easily sustained, and the impact isn't maximized as much as it could be with a college level initiative. In some cases, our colleges are bigger than some of the colleges I've attended or been part of. So that's just been a huge learning experience. We're working with 5 colleges now, and the goal is to work with every undergraduate college. And it's fascinating to have conversations that happen all the time in the Einhorn Center about quality, community-engaged learning, community-based global learning practice with colleges, with stakeholders there, and with community partners, staff, faculty, and students. The second program I'll mention is, while I was doing the college level work, an associate dean there said, "Richard, we love working with the Einhorn Center, but we can't replicate all of you. And we really need help with quality and how to do this work well. What if you worked with our, in this particular college, the business college, they house what's called Cornell, and they offer a number of different external programs and internal programs for stakeholders in a variety of different disciplines." And so we created 5 online courses as part of that, a student version, a faculty version, and an external version. And we're rolling it out now. And I would say the 5 courses mirror the different dimensions of what we would call high quality community-based global learning. And I won't talk about that until we get to the slide. It'll be a lot easier. So that's me in a nutshell, and really looking forward to it. I should say one more thing. One of the most profound experiences I had is, for 10 years, I was searching for collaborators. And in 2003, I met Eric, and I met Jess Friedrichs and Chris Betcher and a few other people who were working with Amizade. And I hadn't heard of Amizade, and I don't, had to learn how to pronounce it right. Now I have to say, all people be happy. But it was the first time that I met a group of people who I felt like really understood the work well. And since then, I've worked with Jess and Chris and Eric and I helped, co-establish this organization. And it was really meant to mobilize knowledge about how to do this work well. And we've gone through multiple iterations. And now I'm at the privilege of being a sponsor institution with Cornell as part of the collaborative, and to see it grow and evolve. And so it's so cool to see Bibi here. And, we've partnered with Amizade a bunch of times at Cornell and outside of Cornell to do presentations. Also happy to see Mary Price and being in this panel with you, Mary, because the forum is, when the forum was created and established, it's really made a huge difference in study abroad. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all.
That's a great transition. Thank you, Richard. And I see Mary, you've unmuted, and I'll let you take it from here.
Well, hi, everybody. Greetings from Indianapolis, where I'm located today. And it's rainy here. We're beginning to feel the effects of Hurricane Helene. If you are joining us anywhere that is being touched by it, I hope you're all safe and sound. Again, another intersection with local and global in our weather patterns and with climate change. It's interesting being in this space because I find myself betwixt and between. And if you had to ask me like how I think about my professional life, like my entire career and personal life just feels like a constant state of betwixt and between. And so I'm going to apologize in advance because I know I'm going to use terms sometimes in different ways from the rest of us in this room. And part of it is because I am constantly navigating in and out of spaces where I'm trying to figure out how do I share a message or begin to open a space for conversation when I know our price terms and sacred cows may vary? How do I hold that space, both to kind of challenge myself and then to kind of find a place where we can meet in the middle? And so if I say something, both not only in the intro, but over the course of the conversation where you're like, that struck off with me, like I'm not following you on that, please just drop it in the chat. Because I recognize that for many of us, some of us began in higher education. Some of us have degrees maybe in higher education. Some of us come from community practice. Some of us may be social workers. Some of us may be healthcare professionals. Some of us, like myself, my educational background is in anthropology and more specifically archaeology. And we all oftentimes come to this work, but we're often now presented with a frame of professionalization in the work that's grounded out of higher education as a field of study. And I want to put this on the table as part of my intro, but also part of the conversation I think is part of this, is that most of us are journey people. We've come to this from a lot of different places, trying to tackle and engage with and support learners or address a range of outcomes, but we're often starting from very different starting points. And one of the opportunities that I think global community-based global learning creates, both the collaborative as an entity and the frameworks, is a demand to kind of hold space for the time to open up and make those identities and positionalities visible. Too often in my position in a nonprofit association that's working across institutions, for too long, things that I've seen when I was in a higher education institution, which I'll talk about in a minute, like we don't give ourselves grace for that time, or we feel under pressure not to allow that time. So I'm grateful to everyone here for that. So who am I? I'm the Director for Teaching and Learning at the Forum and Education Abroad, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit membership association. We're recognized by the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission as the standards development organization for the field of education abroad in the U.S. So today I'm coming very specifically from that lens. We provide professional development opportunities and resources, both to education abroad professionals. And for those of us who are coming from the civic engagement inside of the house, those would be people who are the equivalent of our community engagement professionals. Or if you're coming from a straight up teaching and learning lens, there are instructional designers, friends you might see in the Center for Instructional Excellence. We have a set of standards, the standards of good practice, that guide our work. They guide our work in terms of the professional development opportunities that we provide. And I've dropped a link into there for you. And they provide a means by which we can evaluate the quality of education abroad programs. So it's a real good intersection point, I think, between global community-based learning and the work of education abroad. We have over 800 institutional members that include U.S. colleges and universities, overseas institutions and consortia, agencies, NGOs, and others. I think one thing to call out about the work of the forum that I think is really critical and doesn't get enough attention is the Code of Ethics. The Code of Ethics asks 4 really critical questions about, is this work in the best interest of the learners, their growth and well-being? Is it truthful, fair, and transparent? Is it equitable and inclusive? And is it grounded in reciprocity? And do host communities agree? I want to add a question to all 4 of those questions, because I think, again, it's another point of intersection between the forum's work and community-based global learning and the collaborative's work. Is for each of these questions, who gets to decide? Who gets to decide if it's truthful, fair, and transparent? Who gets to decide if it's equitable or inclusive? Who gets to decide if it's grounded in reciprocity? And who gets to decide who within host communities agrees? And it is these questions, these ethical questions, that I think there's a lot more space for us to be engaging our learners with, engaging ourselves in, and working across sectors in. So I share that as something that, again, I think is an untapped opportunity. In my role in the association, I'm here to be working predominantly with academic units and with faculty. So I'm looking across institutions, and similarly in the way Richard is, when I was at IUPUI before coming to the forum, where I was for 16 years, you know, I liken myself to being more of a rabble rouser, sometimes a co-navigator, sometimes a passenger in your vehicle, or sometimes a hitchhiker. I'm always on somebody else's journey. It's often not my story. I'm there to be a thought partner and a critical friend. And the degree to which we have a relationship, the degree to which we have overlapping interests, that was kind of my point of view. So I worked across community engaged research, community engaged teaching, student affairs, all these different spaces, as well as the global. And now I find myself in an association that's very squarely focused on this broader issue of concern in international education, which is about mobility. And I think this question of mobility comes back to the heart of a question that Eric's going to raise with us in just a minute. But I raise it because this is one of the places where I feel betwixt and between in new ways today. And I think I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Mary. There's a lot of excitement around the who gets to decide question that you raised, and really important. Thank you for those comments. I just thinking about some of the things we all did to prepare and meet and the timing around the power outage. Richard, I wonder if you could share the summary you've recently done about where community-based global learning is in the literature, but anticipating after we hear a bit from Richard on that, and I'm gonna give away one of the themes. It seems like community-driven maybe one of the things that people are trying to do more of. But then who gets to decide how it's going is kind of the critical question. We could go over to Bibi after you share a bit, Richard, for that question that's come up in the chat from Bibi and All People Be Happy's lens, you know, how the field may or may not be shifting. But Richard, what are you seeing in the literature? How we're writing, thinking about it?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And just so folks know, I'm just undertaking a systematic review of this community-based global learning state of the field, and got over about 700 articles. And today I just wanted to mention, I just did a brief review of two big journals in community engaged learning, the Michigan Journal of Community Service Learning and the Journal of Higher Education Outreach and Engagement, Michigan Journal being at Michigan and JHEOE at the University of Georgia, and then also Frontiers and the Interdisciplinary Journal Study Abroad. So I looked at those three journals from their founding, all of them around 95, 96, and just reviewed articles that had anything to do with global engagement, community-based global learning, intercultural learning, service learning, international service learning, global service learning, lots of different terms. And out of that, there were about 102 articles from the 90s. And it's just been interesting to kind of see the theories. So I looked at the theories. I looked at the focus of the studies, whether it was on student learning or community impact or both, faculty learning, institutional change. And so I wanted to get a better understanding of some of the concepts, the methods, the language, really just to kind of get a sense of the parameters of the field, where they conducted inside the US, outside the US as a collaboration. And so I'm just going to cite a couple things that I found from just the initial review from just those three journals and a little over 100 articles. So one big finding is there's really no overarching theory across those studies that people are talking about together. So, you know, if you just look at Frontiers, there isn't a lot of cross-pollination. So if you think that this is about civic engagement and global learning and global citizenship, and there isn't a lot of cross-pollination. So that's one thing I would suggest, or, you know, would be interesting to talk about how we do that more proactively among, you know, the study abroad field, international education, the sort of civic engagement, service learning, community engagement field, and study abroad. Most of the studies were on student learning. Shouldn't be a surprise. Student learning outcomes, particularly in Frontiers. It is a journal around study abroad. So a lot of studies. I was pleasantly surprised. In fact, most of the movement toward community-based global learning happens really after 2015, particularly in frontiers, where there's more robust conversations around service learning. And I think that even probably coincides with the standards, the forum, and a movement towards service learning. And then another just aspect is, there aren't a lot of, the methods are typically qualitative. So there's a predominant focus on qualitative studies. I was pleasantly surprised that there are a couple of participatory action research studies and mixed method studies. About 14% of those 100 and over a little bit over 100 were mixed method studies. And then the number of theories are just they're pretty extensive, and there just isn't a lot of accumulation of knowledge of building on a particular set of theories. And so I think that's something that the field might try to think about, like, is there an overarching conceptual framework that we can use for community-based global learning? I think I'll just stop there, Eric, just to give Bibi, people might have more questions about the details of that work. But I think the biggest thing that came out from me is just this notion of cross-pollination of the theories we use, the methods to really mobilize knowledge together and build more networks that allows us to cross-pollinate the theory and practice around this work. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for that, Richard. And I know you wanted to share a slide later, so we might be able to return to that. But yes, absolutely. So if one of the things we seem to be seeing in frontiers, for example, is more attention to community-driven, Patrick Eccles' question in the chat is really great for Bibi, representing All People Be Happy. What are the most common issues you're seeing in terms of pushing back on university partners, or any observations you would have about the last several years in relation to how power dynamics may or may not be shifting, or how the field is changing?
Yeah, good question, Patrick. I think that, I find myself in my years working with Amizade, and now All People Be Happy, is that, we're working with more high schools who are appreciating this experiential learning and community-based learning. And this shifts, I think, within, global education and study abroad. And so I almost feel that education, higher education and high school are sort of on different chapters in this transit and in this movement. And especially in this space, right? I mean, I think the folks that we work with 99% of the time try to be really sensitive to the power dynamics, try to be really thoughtful to how the way that I approach this work and the asks that I make of community partners, how that might influence the relationship, right? But specifically, some things that have come up recently, and not necessarily at the high school level. So I take that back a bit. This is from a university, but this has happened probably, I'd say, a total of 5 times in the last 12 months. And that is people coming to us with very rigid itineraries and saying, make this happen. And it's the lack of understanding of the nuance where this isn't conventional tourism. This isn't how this works. This is not what our community partners do. This is not their mission. This is not the type of education that they want to engage with. And so that happens maybe less and less over time. But again, it's faculty coming in and saying, this is what I know that my students need to engage with, as opposed to taking a more humble approach and saying, there's a lot that I may not know that community partners can teach both me and my students. Another thing that's very sort of in your face and explicit, we push back and say, that's not going to be possible. We have to meet somewhere in the middle, but that's not how our community partners work. If you're unable to adjust, we aren't either. And so that's a very clear, we cannot work together. We're not the network that's a good fit for you. And granted, but from an organizational standpoint, it would have probably been very difficult. I don't know. I don't want to put words into your mouth, Eric, but when you were ED of Amizade, it may have been less easy to say no to things, right? When you're trying to be an organization that's trying to stay afloat. And those are the that's the difficulty of the power dynamic, right? Is that sometimes we do things to make things work. And that's the reality that as an organization like All People Be Happy, as well as, and certainly our community partners, that's the reality that we live in. And it's definitely the reality that our community partners exist in. And that is this constant balance of, we need to partner with education partners for us to engage in community-based learning. The less, I would say, the more nuanced and less explicit things that come up is that finding changes on the ground pieces and the community-based pieces that absolutely have budgetary implications, and a lack of sensitivity and acknowledgement of that when faculty and staff come in and want to make changes, right? Like, want to get into the details, want X, Y, and Z to happen. And the budgetary consequences or implications are very real. And pushing back on that, especially for community partners, can be really challenging, right? Because of that, I mean, and I think we're all aware of that power dynamic of like, oh shoot, I don't want to say no, because if I say no, what happens? And to what extent do we do all sorts of acrobatics to make something happen? And so I think that the shift that maybe I've seen, and I'm going to say this without right now having like a concrete example, and that is, things are more nuanced, like things are less in your face in terms of the explicit sort of a power, the abuse of the power dynamic there, right? And so it's in little things I find myself sort of dealing with, is managing the relationships around budget and how much people are asking for changes, and the implications around how much community partners need to spend to make people happy. I don't know, I kind of want to see if Melissa has something to add to that, but those were sort of like the two things that I could think about to give more concrete examples. Let's see.
Well, and Melissa, do you have anything you'd like to add? I have a question.
Not to put you on the spot, Melissa, I'm sorry. It's awkward.
No, I think it's good. I think you nailed it. I think there's one other thing that I've seen come up maybe in post program or something, which is kind of whoever's planned the program with us, we've reflected on what service means and defined that, and like us, like as administrators and the people planning the program, feel pretty on the same page about how we define community-based global learning and service. And then we still, through reflection and everything, can't quite get the students there. And they'll come back from a program still saying like, oh, well, I thought we were going to do more, or I didn't think that this counted as service. And I think that there is still some work to be done on our end, of course, and also when preparing students on your campuses to have these critical conversations about what it means to actually have a community take the lead, and what it means to like actually experience what someone is showing you when you go to their community as a visitor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you. And I think I want to try to take two different strands there and see if they'll weave together a bit. So one thing is this work remains counter-normative in fairly significant ways, I think it's fair to say. And so when many people come through our educational system, they have ideas about service and development. And when they sign up for a thing that apparently might have something to do with that, if they're not very busy creating clear outputs, they can be frustrated on the one hand. And I think that's something that it's really important in our work, is continuously interrogating and learning from people most affected by injustices precisely what they want to see. And I know All People Be Happy does great work in that area. I was thinking a bit about what you were noticing, the increase in high school participation, because I work at as you all know, a selective college. And of course, we're receiving a lot of the students who have enhanced access to this kind of programming in high school. And that's, I think, shifting our students' perceptions of what's appropriate. And, there are many different higher eds on here, but I'm sure many of us are seeing more of that. And one thing I think we do see greater student flexibility in thinking about what might comprise productive activity, and in fact, many robust, maybe sometimes too much for me, critique of productive activity. But in any case, and then working on the local level, thinking about how to be in partnership, I think there are positive gains in those areas. And I'm not sure we're seeing that ladder to civic activity or ladder beyond particular community partnerships or particular interpersonal relationships. And Mary, I don't know if this is connected enough to the project you've been working on or the way we sort of came back in together, but I know you've been thinking a lot about the intersections of civic, global, and even some other frameworks. And I wonder if you would, like to share what you're seeing there.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting, kind of moving from the civic engagements, more squarely from the civic engagement and community engagement side of the house into global and international education, alongside this kind of focus on mobility as an equity and access issue. So I don't want to minimize the importance of that. I actually want to problematize it a little bit with an example in just a minute. And this focus on interculturalism. And again, interculturalism matters, intercultural learning matters, but it has its limits. And in the same way, civic learning, these conversations on citizenship, in different disciplinary traditions and different spaces, they get problematized in different ways. What I don't see happening from when I'm inside the forum and looking across this broad space of the field. And one of the questions I have here is, what exactly is the field? I think depending who you ask, the field gets defined and its boundaries look very, very different. And so if I'm in a group with, if I'm in a community development organization and I'm with my peers, I'm defining these spaces very, very different than if I'm at an International Education Association meeting or if I'm at a campus compact meeting. Right. So these things look very, very different. So that creates both opportunities for boundary spanning, but creates some what I think that Richard was talking about earlier is some boundary maintenance. Birds of a feather stick together. And I think we see that playing out. I think we could have a much longer conversation about what's kind of driving that. But one of the things that calls out to me right now when it comes to kind of furthering and advancing and expanding community-based global learning is that I think intercultural frameworks bring something very important to civic frameworks. And I think civic frameworks bring something to the party that intercultural frameworks are missing. I'll give an example. One of the things we're hearing increasing reports on from colleagues on sites abroad is that students are bringing what I will frame as incomplete understandings about how to take civic action when they're abroad. So if you see an action or an interaction that you would define perhaps as a microaggression, and that's informed by your understanding and lived experiences in the US context with its own histories and traditions around marginalization, injustice, legal frameworks, right? We can go on down the list, but you take that understanding and apply it in the immediacy of an encounter that is off, that you see that there's something wrong in this moment. It can lead to cultural misunderstanding. The rules, the norms, the interaction, the sources of tension and marginalization don't completely match what we see in the US. But there's often not a space in the preparation of students before they go abroad about preparing for those expectations in terms of educational institutions, in terms of working with community organizations on site, in terms of your ability, capacity, and right to, for example, protest alongside others when there's a march going on in the community. And so this question about how do I take action, not just individually, but how do I participate and contribute to collective action in global context is a huge question that much of the intercultural conversations ongoing don't address and don't go far enough down this very complex web. Community-based global learning, I think, has an opening to step into that space. But I think back to Richard's point, I think there's a lot more conversation and work that's actually bringing people together from different communities of inquiry and communities of practice to kind of look at these issues, not only from our individual stances, but what are we missing and how can we contribute to each other? I'll give a couple of examples. PI, which is the Professional Organizational Development Network of Higher Education. If you look for sessions that were focused on community engaged learning, community engaged global learning, anything on that avenue, there is not one single session in that conference. That network are the folks who are working in your centers for teaching and learning. If we talk about undergraduate research and CURE, Maureen Vandermeer-Peeler's in the room today. She and I were part of a project with Don Whitehead and others at AACU and Purdue. We were looking at how do we think about mentored undergraduate research in global context. When we think about study abroad, global learning, community engaged learning, our undergraduate research offices and partners are often not at the table. So we're having separate conversations around mentoring, around cultural humility, around who's at the table and what are the impacts, much less also how do we make space for community organizations to actually have voice in decision-making, not just be beneficiaries or participants in the process. And Maureen, if you want to contribute and pop in at any time, we welcome that too.
Well said, Mary.
So those are a couple of the things. Those are a couple of things on my mind. Go ahead, Maureen.
No, I was just giving you positive reinforcement. You said it beautifully.
I'll pause there. There's a couple other things on my mind, but I'm mindful that we want to, that Bibi and Richard and others might have things to contribute here too.
Right, and I actually just wanted to share something, to agree and share some pieces back and pass over to Richard. So that sort of some of what Mary was describing there reminded me of a couple of moments in recent years that we've had with our center. So we've been fortunate to work with a large Arabic podcasting initiative based in Amman, Jordan, and actually the director kind of gets inspiration from This American Life and talks about the value of long form narrative storytelling and story sharing as civic organizing. And I think a lot of us, especially in intercultural spaces, story is so powerful. And this person is, in a global context, a progressive person and a Jordanian and very much in his context and out of his context, a global person, right? And one of the things he loves about long form narrative is he sees it as opening perspectives. And he shared, and again, this particular, it's called SOWT, S-O-W-T, which I don't speak Arabic, but I understand it can mean voice, it can mean vote. It's a really cool organization. So they're based in Jordan, but their highest download space is Saudi Arabia. And as an example of one of the long form narratives they've had a lot of downloads on, it's an interview with a mother in a traditional household, understanding her son coming out as gay. And this sort of space opening from people opening it in their own way, in their own space. We have students interning in the back end of this particular initiative. The students aren't out front, but I'm thinking about this now because that person shared with us that many times when people come internationally, and especially when they're interested in LGBTQ rights activism, people from the US and UK often have a much stronger orientation toward explicit forms of advocacy. And the approach that he was articulating and suggesting works better in the space is, advocacy that's not so on the nose, essentially. And he was sharing a story about in Qatar, actually, during the World Cup, some LGBTQ network activists who were from the area, from Doha, being really frustrated by UK allies, the people, UK people attempting to be allies, that they saw, you know, push things back a little bit. So agreeing very much and thinking about that cultural humility or intercultural praxis being so important in space. I also really, I hope briefly wanted to articulate what I mean when I say civic, or are we seeing an absence of civic or critical civic? One thing that I do think we're seeing happening is more attention to civil society advocacy in various ways that doesn't necessarily attend to political power as exhibited through jurisdictions, voting, and global governance. And what I mean here at Haverford College is, as much as we love to say we're close to Philadelphia, when our students vote, it's in Haverford Township, which is a township of almost 49,000 people. And that's about the size of Harrisburg. And we spend a lot of time trying to help them understand this is where you are. And something about the size of Harrisburg is a serious thing to leverage if you care about climate change, for example, because all of your experience of how the roads are set up are township level decisions in Pennsylvania, right? And school board, and so many issues are so local, but then of course they influence Haverford Township, our congressional races, Senate races. This year, we're all aware that Pennsylvania has a presidential vote in bid matters, but trying to really work with them to leverage upward to understand the notion of global governance and the way that the UN SDGs operate is a way that we're trying to help them see staggering where their political voices are located if they're US voting citizens, and if they're not, then it's also another path. But there's so much to be done in civic that's different from political, and I'm not sure though we all benefit from a world that is interdependent, most of us on this call benefit from a world that is interdependent and connected in significant ways. The civic education, many places doesn't seem to attend to those interconnections. That's something that's on my mind a lot, but I spoke too long. I want to make sure, Richard, you know, I offer opinions, you offer questions and frameworks and parameters, right? In ways that are really healthy and really wonderful to organize input from across a whole institution. So you've got a framework that you've been using increasingly at Cornell that I believe, if I can find the slides, you were going to share and talk about a bit.
Yeah, and all of that is built off of all sorts of thinking over the years. And I should mention, when Eric, Chris, Jess, and I got together and thinking about the parameters of the field and what we'd all learned in our different experiences, life experiences, we started asking this question with Amizade, or All People Be Happy, and others. If you had to design a framework to think about an educational framework with anyone, with a high school teacher, with a faculty member in whatever discipline, with a community partner in a not-for-profit organization or for-profit or a government agency, any stakeholder, what would be the kinds of things that you would think about that would instill quality, that everyone should at least think about at a minimum? And so over the years with the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative, we ran a bunch of institutes and summits and educational workshops where we just crowdsourced different ideas like the Fair Trade Learning Rubric or the Global Engagement Survey, all the toolkit that was developed with the collaborative. And so my involvement with the collaborative has helped me think about not only our own institution at Cornell and other institutions, but but also how to share resources with various stakeholders, not only at Cornell. So I don't want to just frame this as a Cornell thing. It's really very much informed by the work that's happened over the last couple of decades. Not only the book that Eric and Jess and Chris and I put together, which was meant to get ethical engagement, and we have a framework there that presents like, what are all the things that someone, not all the things, but the minimal things that every kind of program, whether it's from a higher education institution or a third-party provider or a high school, what have you, any space that you're in, what would be some quality things that you would think about that everyone could share in common and converse about, just like the social change wheel questions, which you'll see up here in this slide over on the left-hand side is the social change wheel. And the goal of, so we built these 5 courses, and again, a lot of it mirrors the book I mentioned and a lot of the resources on the community. We highlight the book and the collaborative all throughout these modules. And they, as I said, it's also an external version for any other institution or organization. So the first course is really like, what does it mean to build a better world through, and we say community engaged learning, but we also throw out lots of different languages. So we're inclusive about that. And the first one is just to think about, who are you as someone that wants to contribute to the world? And so we build off of some of the nice activities, but we also talk about, like, what's your theory of change? What does change look like? What kind of change would you like to see? And again, that can be a discussion in dialogue with a partner, with students and peers, with faculty and staff, with higher education administrators. And so there's a number of exercises aimed at thinking about learning, thinking about change making, and it's very invitational. The second part we've talked about a little bit here is part of the framework, cultural humility. Each of these courses has 3 modules. And so, and many, many tools. And I should say there are videos, too many of me, but there are also, I didn't know this as part of, I didn't know I had to create videos as part of this course with Cornell. But what was cool is they have this component of their work with it called ATEs, or Ask the Experts. And so I invited in community partners, staff, faculty, and students to talk about these various dimensions of the courses. So there's tools, activities, videos, and then lots of content, and an initial kind of connection with some scholarship that's being done in different organizations. A lot of shout outs to the collaborative. The other one is just partnerships. So we take a community driven approach to that. We want people to think about assets and strengths and, who has knowledge, who has experience. And so instead of coming in and doing deficit based approaches, I just highlight a couple things. We talk a lot about the identity pie and 3 dimensions of cultural humility. We think critical reflection is really important in dialogue. There's a course on that. And then the 5th course is really about activating all of that learning. It's not necessarily, you don't have to take them in any kind of, you can take them independently, but we really want to ask people about the action-oriented nature of their work. Like, what's their vision around change now after they've thought about all these things, who they are and who they're working with? The issue, we bring in the SDGs. There's lots of issues and resources and organizations working as networks. How do you tap into that? How do you envision yourself working with others to build a better world? And so we're excited about that, but I would throw out the question, to Eric's point, I do like to ask questions. If someone said to you, like, no matter what would you hold yourself accountable to? What would be those key dimensions that you'd want to talk about with your partner, with students, with staff, with faculty, with administrators? That 5th part is about institutional change, by the way. So we often talk about students, faculty, community partners, but we all work in hopefully some community, whether it's an not-for-profit or a higher education institution or other community-based organizations. So what does change look like in order to do these things well within an institution? So anyway, that's just a little brief overview, but I wanted to highlight it because it's something that I've benefited from being part of the community-based global learning collaborative over the years and all of the events and workshops. This is not a culmination, it's just a draft in progress, right? But I'd love to hear what people think in the room, the panelists and folks that are here. Like, what are those key dimensions that you think people should be engaging with when you think about quality? Do no harm, do good, but then recognize your complicity in potential harm or harms that are already being committed. What's your role in that? How do we ensure quality?
Richard, thank you for all that. And thanks to everyone for the chat that's very much underway. I hope, so I believe at the moment we got I know a couple of people had to drop off at once, or we got a couple dozen people in the room. I hope we'll be able to chime in. And if you want to drop a question in, it doesn't have to be by the chat, right? We can have a conversation here many of us know one another, and if you don't already know several of us, we're very friendly. Trust me, I promise. So I hope people will feel comfortable sharing in. Richard, I had a tiny logistical question. Is that already in operation, and is it available to students for credit? How, just like, what's the student experience of that module?
Yeah, so it's available now. It's not for credit, but students can get a certificate for completing one of the courses or all of the courses. Cornell students, it's because we worked with Cornell, and we had to, it cost some money to develop the tools. We also have an external version for any other institution. Doesn't have to be a higher education institution. Could be a for-profit corporation. We think all of these things are really important for everyone to think about and engage with. And so we have an external version, and there are people at Cornell that would negotiate a scaled price depending on the license, and that could be offered for credit. So another institution could license this and offer it for credit if they wanted to, or offer a certificate or something that indicates you've achieved the work that's in each of the courses. If anyone's interested, they can email me separately. But also the other thing that's really cool is the tools are meant to be mobilized, like to get the tools and activities out there in spite of the actual platform. So all of the tools that we developed as part of this are tools that can be shared more broadly with anyone. So if anybody's interested, and of course, we host workshops that are open to the collaborative and other non-members. So it's really about mobilizing knowledge for us. And, yeah, so that hopefully answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. I noticed a couple of comments about, the extent to which all study abroad is community-based global learning, or should be, or all study abroad can be fair trade learning, or should be. I think that might be an interesting place to go and see where folks' thoughts are. But one thing I would add to maybe complicate a little bit, of course, for me, community-based global learning has always been inclusive of the United States. And actually, especially when I think of the civic needs, because of the disproportionate power of the United States in the global context, there's such an absence of deep global education for so many of our young people. And so to me, that's critical. So it's really important that we're doing community-based global learning. And we do here in area, we work with Fishadelphia. That'd be one of my favorite recent partnerships. Fishadelphia is a network of fisher folk who are small fisheries, and they're connected in a way to communities that have been marginalized from fresh fish. And it's a network of like an alternative economy, really creating a solution in the 6th largest city in the US for marginalized community getting access to fresh fish. So there's ecological implications, there's human inclusion implications. And I'm mentioning the domestic, US domestic in community-based global learning as part of this challenging question of whether all education abroad should be community-based global learning, because I do think including our institutions at home, so to speak, sort of further complicates or challenges the question. And maybe in some ways that part of the challenges here is the challenge of scale. Community-based and global is intimate, relational, and some of these larger ed abroad programs and larger institutions are settled parts of infrastructure in ways that aren't as flexible. This has really been wonderful, let me say, really wonderful. The thought provocation that you all bring, and the work you bring and deliver, and the aspirations as well. I know when a couple folks signed off, they said, will there be a recording? And we have been recording, and we'll double check with the panelists, but we anticipate sharing that so long as it's okay. And this closing conversation reminded me of, well, some of the places I get challenged or hung up, universities, colleges, higher ed institutions at their best are just civil society organizations that are collections of resources where people are investigating what it means to be human and trying to expand understanding of what it means to be human, and to share and create and to diversify the contributions to that thinking in a continuous and growing way. And it is such a polarized time that we can get even extremely mad at the institution. Right? There's so much distrust of institutions, but the work that we're doing can be about leveraging institutional strengths in order to contribute to these just, inclusive, sustainable communities that bring us together and bring the collaborative together and inspire the work. So I hope I will see all of you at WPI in November. And if you can't make it there, I hope you'll stay involved in the community different ways. Thanks for being with us today. And we will continue to have these online conversations. And thank you again. I appreciate all the panelists. Thank you all very much for your part today as well.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Very inspiring.
Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Have a great weekend.
You take care. Thank you, friends.
We got through it, Mike.